Yeah, is that or you have my slides or
did you email?
you did email them? Pretty simple. Last time. Yeah. Come again. Yeah.
Did you send them to Sharon or to you?
I think.
Did you send them to me?
I
So do you have slides?
Yeah, no.
Okay. Yeah.
But I would like to print something. Where's the nearest printer?
Do you know the nearest printer?
I'm sorry, what?
Nearest printer?
No, I don't know the printer. Should we ask maybe about the printer?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to print some notes that I made.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You might want to go find. You have access to a printer?
Do you want to just use my iPad?
Okay, solution, because we don't know about a printer.
559. Just send me those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I printed mine out before I came, so yeah.
Something for next time.
Here it is something. Yeah, so I'm like, phone will go off and I don't like having it there.
We had an idea of having a display on the monitor over there, but this room.
Yes.
The deadline of that.
Because I'm gonna have this out and then it's gonna be clicking and making noises because I never know how to turn that on. Right. We're gonna have a flood of people in the next minute, I can tell. Maybe when they know that they have to indicate on their grant application which QuIRI talks they've been to, that will increase.
Oh,
That will increase.
early.
That is new. That's
Yeah.
a new innovation.
Prove your loyalty.
Yes. So you guys already got the money, but you know, it's been a while. Hello, welcome. You found us.
Took me a few tours.
Okay, I think somebody is out there trying to like
Shepherd
find
people.
the lost people. Was it difficult for you all to
Yes.
find? You said you were circling. No, you knew how to get in here?
Instructions were good.
The instructions are good, yes.
I was just staring at one of the fire escape maps to try to figure out.
Oh,
Yeah.
All right, even a different route. What about you, Nick?
I came here when there was like cinnamon rolls last semester.
All right, so
Oh, yeah.
there is a cinnamon rolls. They bring cinnamon rolls and feed people, right?
Yeah.
So, you know.
February 9th.
Yeah, February 9th.
All right.
Food related things are always my calendar.
You have one question?
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Okay,
It's not that yet. Yeah.
you're gonna talk from your screen. All right, okay.
I can like screen that, but.
So we are gonna get started and hopefully people are lost and will find their way in. Thank you for showing. Welcome to the first QuIRI event of the spring 2024 semester. For today, we are going to hear from our 3 graduate students who received support from QuIRI for their dissertation research. And we're going to do this as a panel format. So while each of them would like to have the entire 45 minutes to talk about their research, we're not going to do it this way. I'm going to introduce them and then we're going to ask a couple of questions and then we'll open it up for question and answer, right? And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the upcoming grant applications for those of you who want to apply. We have some new requirements, right? And then we can have wine and cheese. Yay. Okay, so our 3 featured speakers are from 3 different departments. And each has used their QuIRI supported funding in different ways to gather data, travel to research sites, and refine their topics. And one has successfully reapplied for additional funding to return to the site. And I'm not sure if this is finishing off the work or deepening the work. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our three panelists. We have Joseph Lasky from a PhD candidate in government, Emily Hillenbrand, who is a PhD candidate in global development, and Simon O. Kim, who is in the city and regional planning, right? How about we start? I'm going to start by asking each of you to briefly describe your research question. I'm going to start with Joseph.
Yeah, and please cut me off if I'm taking too long.
Okay, 5-minute like butterfly net or yeah.
That's good. So first, thank you, Sharon, for inviting me and putting together this panel. Yeah, like Sharon mentioned, I'm Joseph Lasky, PhD candidate in the government department. I focus on comparative politics, within that African politics, and most specifically Cameroonian politics in Central Africa. So my dissertation is about legacies of conflict in Cameroon. I'm interested in particular in how memory of conflict shapes political engagement, attitudes, and group identity over time. Broadly speaking, we've identified a number of links between victimization from violent conflict and political outcomes. And one way of categorizing these outcomes is as mobilizing and demobilizing effects. We can cut it other ways as well, but this is how I'm focusing on it specifically. So an example is voter turnout. We know that victimized segments of the population tend to vote at higher rates than other segments of the population. However, there's also an equal demobilizing effect in other instances where people turn out to vote less when they have been victimized by violent political conflict. So this divergence in legacies is apparent at levels of low-cost political engagement, like voting, as well as higher-cost forms like protest behavior. So my research project addresses the conditions under which victimization mobilizes a population rather than demobilizes. And what I focus on, the condition that I focus on most is the alignment between local political cleavages and the master cleavage that drives the overarching conflict. And so the alignment between those two cleavages or cleavage structures in turn shapes the form of violence in terms of how intra-communal it is versus intercommunal. And this in turn shapes the character of the legacies of the conflict. So as far as the mechanisms that I'm interested in, and I'm looking at the politics and reproduction of memory in the post-conflict environment, particularly within families and small communities. Family socialization is in general a really important determinant of an individual's political life in general. So I'm interested in how facets of that socialization operate in the post-conflict environment. Nearly done. So geographically, I mentioned I focus on Cameroon. There was a political party and movement, the Union of the People of Cameroon, the UPC. It was an anti-colonial movement founded in 1948. It was banned by the French from political participation shortly thereafter, a few years later, and they initiated a guerrilla war that lasted through 1970. And it was defeated. The members of the UPC were rebranded as terrorists by the independent Ahijo administration. And so at that point in time, state narrative of conflict was hegemonic, and promoting alternative narratives generally risked imprisonment. It was very, very dangerous to talk about the UPC outside of the way the state framed the conflict. And then real quickly, methodologically, I focus on, or I draw from qualitative and quantitative approaches. So I've been reviewing French archival material in an effort to more precisely map out instances of violence and political strength of the UPC. I'm leaving this month for Cameroon to complement archival research from France with that of the National Archives in Cameroon. That trip is supported in part by QuIRI, so that's the upcoming grant. My previous 2 trips to Cameroon were dedicated to interviews. So I conducted interviews across the 4 regions of Cameroon that were most heavily affected by the war. And that was particularly that preliminary fieldwork trip in which I started the interviews was funded by the first QuIRI grant. The archival work and the interviews are ultimately going to contribute to a survey that I'll be conducting this spring as well. So.
Thank you. Excellent. He's probably going to hit up CCSS for that survey funding. Right.
I think I reached it. I think I've got it.
Excellent. So this is why we had the event today, because Joseph is leaving soon to collect additional. Okay. All right, great. Thank you for the elevator pitch. Sang-Oh, do you want to go next and tell us about your research?
So again, I'm Sang-Oh Kim. I'm a PhD candidate from the City and Regional Planning Department, which is under AAP. I'm a urban planner with transportation interest. And the particular research that was funded by QuIRI has a working title of Mobility Care of Older Adults, a biographic approach to family caregiving and travel behavior. So the aim of my research was essentially to see what kind of ripple effect does elder care responsibility, so family members taking care of older aging adults in their family, has on a person's travel behavior. America is aging. Within 10 years, almost a quarter of the American population will be 65 plus. And most of these older adults will be taken care of none other than family members, who are known as family caregivers. And in most cases, these family caregivers, what we know are they tend to be women, and also they tend to be in their boomers age, so between like 50, like late 40s and like 50s, and then they also are large amount of them are in their workforce. So often they face this intense work-family struggle. Now, we know about that part of family caregivers is kind of research has been accumulated. We know a lot about the work-family conflict of the caregivers. We know a lot about their burnout, their stress, the health implications of being a caregiver and juggling that work-family conflict. But little has been done about looking at this through transportation and mobility lens. Because to be a caregiver, to provide care, the movement is absolutely critical, because still in America, not that many, the multi-family households are still a bit of rarity in America, or like in Asia or Africa, where living together with your grandparents is kind of more common. So travel is essential. So how does assuming that elder care responsibility would affect that travel behavior, mobility dimension of the family caregivers? So that's the research that I am doing, and through the QuIRI funding, which has been used to essentially buy a gift card as a token of appreciation for those who participate in the interviews. Now, since this is a qualitative research, I think I'll speak more about it later. There was a bit of a limitation that, well, I envisioned that I wanted this to be a in-person mostly. So, and also seeing that I'm in Ithaca, Cornell, from the beginning, I limited myself in terms of geography that I'll focus on New York State. And I guess, should I talk about the sample recruitment right now, or do you want to add it later?
If it's part of the intro, yeah, you can talk about it now. We have time. Flex and Emily, as long as Emily doesn't.
So, since these caregivers they are relatively, how do I say, in the literature, they are known to be politically unorganized group yet. As in, because caregivers are very private about their duty as duty in caregiving, and they a lot of them see what they do as a very private familiar matter. There is not much of a, how do I say, advocacy organization that you can easily contact to reach out to these people. So as part of my sample recruitment, I essentially spent a month contacting what is called county offices of aging across the New York State. By law, every county in New York State has to install this office of aging, which is one-stop agency for senior services. So my sample recruitment, essentially, it was a three-step in a way. My first step was to build rapport with these agencies because, again, they are very protective of their clients because they see their seniors and caregivers as a vulnerable population. So my first thing was to connect with these agencies, introduce who I am, what I'm doing, what my research is about, and then persuade them to distribute my flyer, my adverts for my research on my behalf to their known clients, known collaborators, and so on. So yeah, this all happened like around the second, third quarter of this last year, and yeah, eventually I just distributed a screening survey to the people who were interested in my research, and I've received about 200 responses. And from that, I managed to interview about 23 caregivers thus far. I plan to interview more. Maybe I need more funding, but I plan to interview more people in the coming month and turn this into a publication, I guess. So I will leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you. It's always interesting to hear about like how you think about recruiting your sample, right? So, okay, Emily, you are on for your elevator pitch.
And it's also looking at post-conflict dynamics in Burundi in the Great Lakes region. And my research explores masculinity, violence, and reconciliations in this post-conflict context. So Burundi has had a post-colonial history of just successive violence, genocide, political instability, and chronic crisis. And it is now the poorest country in the world. And it's very highly dependent on aid, but has had very little intervention other than humanitarian and refugee responses. So I'm responding to literature in sociology that looks at relations between sort of violent masculinities, militarism, and the gendered consequences of conflict. So in the post-conflict context, there are very high rates of sexual and gender-based violence for women. And men also lost a lot of land, assets, livestock, which are kind of the pillars of responsible masculinity. So in this aftermath of the Civil War and the overt violence, a lot of the consequences are increased rates of gender-based violence against women, high rates of alcohol abuse, and men just sort of dropping out of the economy and kind of leaving women to do the rest of the work. So that's kind of the literature that I'm drawing from, but as well, I'm coming from the development intervention side, and development practice also has a keen interest in looking at engaging men and masculinities for gender equality outcomes. So my research is kind of an ethnography that uses the entry point of this one unique development intervention. It's called the Abatanga Mutu approach that tries to transform masculinities from these outlier, like the most abusive, the most violent, least economically productive men, and kind of work with them to transform them into more really committed to nonviolence and masculinity based on gender equality. And it's kind of a evangelical approach. It's really based on one man's personal transformation. He kind of attended training, had some new ideas, and took a personal decision to like transform his life and stop using violence. And one staff member of this NGO that's working with them found that story really inspiring and thought other people could benefit from them. So it kind of moved organically from one man to another, and it was picked up by this NGO. And these men, once they commit to this life transformation and commit to becoming Abatanga Mutu members, It's really kind of a status change, and it's community sanctioned. The community kind of observes whether they've sincerely made this change or not. And then it's kind of a break from that past to this new beginning. So I came across this in my development work before starting my PhD, and I was really curious to know more about how it works because it's very unique to Burundi. I haven't seen this kind of approach elsewhere. So my study is an ethnography of this particular movement, and I was based in looking at one of these Abatanga groups in one village, and to see really kind of how exactly does this work? What's the process of transformation? What is being transformed? How does it socially transform the community? And also, like what development ideologies are informing this intervention, and sort of, why in Burundi in particular, what is it about this post-conflict context, and what are the relations between these intra-household reconciliations and the broader peace and reconciliation processes in Burundi? So I did an ethnography of like 10 months based in one village, and I studied that one group as well as the national structure that is kind of managing the spread of this movement. And also I was working closely with the NGO that fostered this movement to understand kind of how it works on different levels and how it's evolved and what it produces.
Okay, so I have questions about what kind of challenges you faced when you went into the field that you learned from and pivoted on. So this sounds very challenging. So when you initially went there, what were you expecting, and in what ways did you have to maybe pivot? I'm going to start with Emily. Yeah.
I think I initially envisioned like a classic anthropology embedded in the village, and that really was not safe, practical, or possible. So I ended up being stationed in the nearest city, which was like an hour. So it ended up being more structured visits. I did like 3 to 4 visits a week with my team. But that also allowed me to do more participant observation with the national structure and get a better sense of how they worked. Administratively, it was very difficult to get started. It was about a 2-month process of getting all the research permits. They're very, very careful about who gets to do research and where. So that was a bit of a lengthy process. And I can use that time to organize my team and do the initial trainings, but I was a bit frustrated. But it is part of it.
It is definitely part of the process, but we never anticipate the bureaucracy, even though we have to go through it for IRB to get there, right? So, okay. Sang-Oh, what were the challenges? I'm impressed that you identified organizations that could help you find, because I always find that finding the right group to help you with interviews is a challenge, right? So what were some, what did you walk in thinking when you started your project, and how did your thoughts evolve as you were in the process?
There are a few things, but the one I guess what I prepared to mention for this panel, well, first thing, I guess I didn't have to go to Africa like you two. So there was
Upstate New York.
Yeah, Buffalo, I think, was the furthest distance I traveled. So wasn't too bad. But I guess when I applied for the funding with Dr. Humphreys, who is not here today, unfortunately, I envisioned actually a 2-part interview. Well, I will interview not just a caregiver, I'll interview the care recipient as well at the second stage. And the reason why I wanted to do that was based on understanding that care is a relational activity, and there might be interesting and different ways in which the household power dynamics could have influenced that caregiver's mobile decision, right? Like for instance, a person might have switched a car from a small sedan to SUV in order to transfer her mother in a wheelchair. But maybe that timeline or choice of the vehicle might have been, determined more by the care recipient than caregiver, even though caregiver is the one who's paying for it, maybe. So, I wanted to interview both care recipient and caregiver in order to find out if there were any of these power dynamics in play behind observed mobility behavior. That did not happen because I think, I think one thing was that I thought I'll be doing a lot of in-person interviews, but it ended up that a lot of them actually preferred Zoom. Because I gave them option like in-person or Zoom, and then I was willing to travel, I guess, up to Buffalo, if the person wants to interview. But no, they all really preferred Zoom. And I think it's like we're coming out of COVID still, so there was that worry, and there was also a bit wary about just speaking to a stranger. So, I could feel that, in through Zoom as well. So I felt like I didn't really get to build enough trust with these people so that they can allow me access to their care recipient, who is arguably more fragile, more vulnerable than caregivers. I mean, and also partly a lot of them, they go through some kind of a illness, dementia as well. So that interview of a care recipient, which I envisioned when I first applied for the funding, when I first designed the project, never happened, unfortunately. And yeah, so I guess there is that challenge that I faced along the way.
And you pivoted, so you're
Yeah.
still doing your interviews.
I still found out a lot of interesting stories from the interviews of caregivers and so on. But yeah, so that's the kind of challenge or pivot that I had to accommodate, along the way. So that's one thing. I'm not sure if you wanna ask us about the positionality, but I can.
After this one, first, so Joseph, challenges is,
Yeah. So going into planning my first trip to Cameroon, I think I envisioned progressing quite a bit faster than I actually did when I was there. And this is a bit of I think, unspoken understanding in political science. No one, especially among the comparativists like me, people just talk about going to their field sites and doing the work, doing the surveys, interviews, whatever, and they never really talk about just how difficult it is from all sorts of point of views, like the administrative point of view, the energy that it takes, the emotional toll it takes. I didn't expect to be so lonely a lot of times, and just like unsure of myself, really. And so prior to going abroad to Cameroon, I considered myself generally adaptable person that would probably like land on my feet and do well doing field work. But everything took longer than I thought, and everything just there was so much more friction on all the moves I was trying to make than I expected. So there is that. I also felt, just in the context, thinking of positionality in particular, but people were much more reluctant to talk to me than, I guess reluctance is the word, unsure about talking to me relative to even interviews I had conducted in West Africa and Benin. Felt like Cameroon was a bit more closed off. The people were a bit more closed off. I couldn't imagine doing like a snowball sample there, because no one would really suggest other people for me to talk to, at least not at this stage of my research and the size of my social network there right now. So that helped me. I decided to break up fieldwork trips, and I think that was a really good decision ultimately, because it helped me mitigate expectations for the next trip and really plan out better how much time everything would take. I also envisioned more support for my theory, like empirically speaking. So it's a little bit difficult when, you're doing these interviews expecting, things to at least in some way, support what you had stepped off the plane with. So it was a little disheartening to watch some of my ideas wither on the vine. But this also, ultimately, I checked my confirmation bias and really leaned into the iterative process of research as opposed to trying to wedge what people were saying into the theory that I had come with. Yeah, I think just the upshot being it's a lot more emotionally challenging and intellectually challenging than I thought it would be.
Thank you. I am curious as to like what can we be doing in our training, or is there anything, or would it scare people away to like prepare better, right? Because this is the invisible part of research, but everybody experiences it. And I don't mind oozing and talking about the challenges, but like there is this perception that, we have to present positive face. So yeah, what would you, I mean, what are the needs of students learning these processes?
So I can just add a comment. I do think open communication about how difficult it will be, especially, I have a real stoic sort of committee. So it's interesting to go to these committee members and be like, Tom, I'm really emotionally overwhelmed today, and seeing them react on that. I'm pretty open about those things, so I think it's less intimidating for me to like go to these people and talk about these things, and that really elicits the responses of like, oh yeah, when I did field work, I like cried the first week, and like all these things that normalize the emotional struggle. So I think that openness, but like you mentioned, there's really no substitute for going, which is why I think taking the preliminary fieldwork trip for me, having low expectations, and like honestly, like one of my actionable items when I did my preliminary fieldwork trip was like, I want to make a friend so that they can help me adjust. And sounds really kind of adolescent, but it really changed my fieldwork. But that preliminary trip really, especially since I didn't have experience in the place I was going, was essential, really improved the next trip.
Anybody else want to take up what more we could have, how better we could have prepared you before you headed off?
I think what I learned from that initial month or two, because I had actually started the process several months before and I thought I was in a good place. And I had people in the different ministries, like people helping me push papers, and it was still just, it's just the way the system works.
Yeah.
And I think I could have used that frustration in a more productive way and kind of just be prepared for this. This is part of the research as well, understanding how things work and not get so worked up over it.
The production function that we kind of imbue you with, you have this amount of time and you have to get this done, is not helpful in a society that moves at a different pace. Saying, oh, is there anything?
I think just in hindsight,
Yeah.
I think I would probably like to spend more time. I don't know how do I say spread out my interviews a bit more. I think again I think what happened with me was that I wanted to kind of progress my research quickly and get it out of pipeline as soon as possible. So I think basically from April till March till May of last year, I focused on building collaborative relationship with agencies. And then my flyers went out around June, and then I selected interviewees like from July onward, and then I squeezed in like 20-something interviews from like late July till September. Again, I thought like I would want it to like,
one a day.
Yeah, exactly, something like that, but I think in hindsight, I think I shouldn't have done that, because not only this is emotionally taxing for myself, but also I think I didn't have enough time to really digest the findings from my previous interview and really use the findings or the gaps from the previous interview to for my next set of interviews and things like that. So yeah, I think the right word to use will be don't hasten yourself too much. I think that's yeah, one recommendation I would give.
Although maybe that needs to go to advisors as well.
Yeah. I had an excellent advisor, by the way, for tips. So
Oh, excellent, but the tempo is part of the process that is challenging to maintain, right? Okay, the question of positionality, someone mentioned positionality. So it's always an issue when we are doing work, but particularly in other countries. Emily, do you want to start and talk about how positionality shaped how you approached your relationships? And
yeah, I mean, it's a very delicate to come in as a white person, as a foreigner, and with connections with the NGO, because there are expectations, even though you're very clear that, you know, this could lead to something, this could lead to a project, this could lead to funding. So there's those kind of expectations, and also interviewing the same group of men was an honor for them, and visiting people's houses was a status symbol. So you had to, there was some complaining, and some people said, why do you keep going to these men who already have all of this? Why don't you come visit me? I mean, I'm also poor. So some of that was really revealing, and I did like include those people and tried to reach out to people who aren't part of that group some more. To be very careful as well with like what kind of incentives to give people. Cash is very not a great idea. Because I was doing repeat visits, so I talked with my driver and the team about what would be appropriate, and we decided on a bottle of cooking oil was a useful thing, and just, you know, drinks and snacks during the interviews. But there's no way around your positionality, I think. For some observations, I did not participate at all. I, you know, had my staff or my research team. So those were spaces I couldn't get at.
Joseph, do you want to talk about positionality, and then we'll have Simon?
For sure. So I've really tried to project or understand how, so I'm very interested in narratives, right? And I would sit down with people for interviews and ask them to tell me things like, how do you talk about this period of Cameroon history with your children, or if, you know, they're a younger generation, all adults, of course. But how did their parents or grandparents or family members talk to them, right? So I'm soliciting narratives. And I know that what someone's telling me could be very different from what they tell their friends or tell their family, right? Because I am similarly foreigner, very easy to pick out as a foreigner, right?
Did you wear the bow tie there?
Oh my goodness. Never, it was so hot all the time. But I think that's not necessarily a detraction from the narratives. I think to recognize that narratives are dynamic and people are selecting the facets of those narratives that they share with me, I think is important in and of itself. So certainly acknowledging that my positionality is influencing the data generating process is critical. And of course, I write that into the articles I'm writing. I also initially envisioned this process of, you know, maybe I read too much James C. Scott before going, but like this process of like just sitting with somebody and talking with them one-on-one. And, you know, that's not how the interviews went when I was there. So I was always with some kind, unless I was speaking with someone in the academic environment, because I also took time to interview graduate students and faculty members. But But if I was traveling, I would travel with someone, typically a grad student from that area, if not the village I was visiting, to help me bridge cultural norms that I didn't know. And sometimes it was more appropriate for them to be the primary interviewer, and for me to just kind of sit back, even though I was clearly looming in the background. You know, I was there and present. But sometimes it was just a more appropriate experience to allow someone else to ask the questions. I also really struggled to recruit female interviewees, and part of that would be, you know, rolling up to somebody's house with like 2 male motorcycle taxi drivers and then a male assistant is like not a great look for necessarily. So I really struggled. So it was like the balance was like 80% male, I think, maybe 85% male, which is something I'm going to try to correct for a little bit by recruiting a female assistant to work with me when I go back. So I don't think there's a better way of doing it. I wish I had thought about that before, but the gender dynamics are very clearly influenced my ability to recruit.
Okay, so this is the advice time about what kind of advice you give people, and then we're going to open it up for, I hope, lots of questions. I have lots of questions, but so if you were to retrospectively thinking, what could I have done differently, or how would I approach this differently? What kind of advice would you give to students thinking about the process at the start and writing a grant application to do this work?
Build in as much flexibility as you can in the budget, in the time, and the methods. Burundi was in the midst of a fuel crisis and rising inflation, and that really made it hard for the staff and the amount that it was also difficult to recruit people who would be willing to go to Gitega, which was like far and in the middle of nowhere. So people with the skill level who would be willing to go there expected more. And I think I would have taken a little bit more time to figure out like kind of the team composition. It was hard, again, to find people willing to go where I was doing the research. I really thought I needed male assistants because I was working with men. I don't think that was necessary. I added the young woman at the end. Finding the right mix of skills. I had a kind of an intellectual research assistant that I worked with before, who wasn't as great at kind of communicating with rural people as some of the other staff that I worked with. So getting the right balance and mix of skills and figuring out where you can train people and build that and the right platform.
So there are 2 of you who kind of work with teams, and Sango, you're doing the work individually, right?
Yeah.
So what advice, so your advice is going to be, I think, different.
I guess, I don't know, like, I'm not sure. I was gonna say just build in as much flexibility as possible as well, you know, in terms of how you schedule, how you know, you might get more tired than you expected in doing this whole thing. But I guess the other thing I just really wanted to emphasize is just reflect on your positionality as much as possible in writing for application, but also in your data collection. That's one thing I guess I wanted to really share. And the other thing is be aware of relying on social media, because you know, my collaborators, they uploaded their flyers to Facebook and things like that, and then and then that invites a lot of. I thanks to my advisor, I had access to Qualtrics, which allowed me to see like where the person recorded their survey. And then I had a whole bunch of people recording survey from Nigeria and India and saying, oh, I live in New York State. And so, so just, think very carefully about like, how are you going to access the kind of people who can tell the story that you want, so, and getting a lot of responses is not always the best. You really want a right people to respond to your request. So, who's going to be the person who's going to be open the gate for me, or they be able to snowball to other people. So yeah, just really think about that carefully before you write a grant or go into the field to contact to recruit your samples. But apart from that, be a good driver. I don't know.
You're gonna go to Buffalo,
Yeah.
get snow tires, yeah. Not in the summer. Okay, Joseph, you also had team, and so you've already talked a little bit about that challenge, but
Yeah,
as somebody who's gotten funding twice.
yeah. It was a bit of an amorphous team though. I did associate myself or affiliate myself with a research institute in Douala that's connected to the University of Douala, though not like within the wall. Well, technically it is within the walls, but it's a separate institution. So having that institutional affiliation in Douala, I think helped especially alleviate some concerns for people that are curious about where I'm coming from, because I could talk about coming from Cornell. That's a lot less meaningful than saying, I'm coming from the University of Douala and this research institute. So I think that's helpful if you don't have a network in place already in the place that you're going. And then I do have a couple of things that I was reflecting on in terms of the grant process too, writing the grant. And the first thing I want to say is that QuIRI is much more than a funding source, right? So before applying for the first grant, I was part of, I think the first wave of working groups that QuIRI had. And then I subsequently did join another working group the next year. These working groups were fantastic for helping shape my work and frame my work, especially for an interdisciplinary audience. In political science, generally writing for either my committee or the journals that are very discipline specific or even subfield specific, right? But that's not what happens when you write grants generally, right? It's either someone on the grant committee is going to be adjacent to your discipline or maybe even like pretty far from your discipline. So understanding how to pitch your work to an interdisciplinary audience and get feedback from outside your discipline, I think that really helped me. So those working groups were wonderful. For the grant application process, I looked at the QuIRI grant as a challenge to frame my work in concise and clear language without hiding behind my disciplinary jargon. So I see this as a way of the grant process as almost a reality check too. Like if I can't explain the value of my work and what I'm doing to an interdisciplinary audience, like maybe it's not as important as I thought. Maybe I need to refine the key facets and think more reflexively about my work. I also saw the grant application as a way, as a reminder to check in with my committee, which, they're all kind of aloof, which is what I prefer. I don't prefer like the more hands-on management style, but that could mean like, if I don't check in, I won't hear from them until the next time I check in. So this is a good way for me to remind myself to check in with them and update them on, where I'm at with my work. And then, I think all the advice that the co-panelists had, I agree with, I support. Flexibility is key.
Okay, thank you. So what I really like is hearing about the research process, because we're busy and we're teaching and we're writing and we don't talk about that as much. And I think in particular graduate students need to hear that, but so do, people, faculty members who are trying to conduct research, because I think we've been there in many ways with the challenges and whatnot, but I don't know that we share it as much or that we have enough of a community to talk about it. So I'm kind of hoping that we actually do more of these sharings with graduate students so that not just you realize you're not in it alone, that we've been there too, but I really do think it's a helpful process. I want to open it up for questions from you people out here. So are there any? Yeah, Lori, go and take it on.
Yeah, great. I'm sorry, because I have to run out after my question. I would love to listen to everyone else's question.
No wine for you.
I'm sorry. I think one of the things that struck me, so I have a question for the panel and then a question for Joseph. One of the things that struck me was the language that you used about the experience. So you were exhausted, you were mentally exhausted, you were lonely, you were sad, you were, it was sort of hard to listen to those things, frustrated, right? And so I wonder, how do you make sense of that? Is that because this is one of your first experiences of this kind of work? Is it that you had expectations that were not met? Is this what you expect to encounter doing this type of research? Is this somehow inherent to ethnography and ethnographic practice? Have you reconciled yourself to that? How does it make you feel about qualitative work or ethnographic work, generally speaking? I'm just really curious about that. And then my question to you is more like a substantive one, which is Central Africa. When I think of Central African violence, I do not think of Cameroon. And so I wonder, why you chose Cameroon and how you thought about the fact, that violence was a bit distant, right, from some of the other places, Central African Republic, Chad, where you could have gone and, it would be like tomorrow, there's, or yesterday, what happened. So I'm just curious, as to how you've, was there some sort of theoretical or other reason for thinking that that was actually more approachable because it was older, or did you pick Cameroon for different reasons?
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll answer the substantive question first. It was a bit of positive returns once I started reading more and more about Cameroon. But I was initially interested in, there is a currently hot separatist conflict in the Anglophone portions of Cameroon, that began in 2017. I was initially interested in language-based nationalist identity, since that's quite the rift in Cameroon. And that kind of just got me more interested in Cameroonian history. And while I do plan to include some items on the survey about the Anglophone crisis, Anglophone crisis, no, I am very much interested in the UPC conflict, in part because there's just not much about it relative to other conflicts, like even the neighboring Biafran War from 1970s Nigeria. So a little bit was strategic in that there's a comparative advantage for like an American political scientist to study a conflict that not many people have looked at. That strategic choice has turned much more into like a personal investment in Cameroonian political development. Like I didn't expect to care so much about people in Cameroon once, like on the outset. I thought like this would be a much more sanitized experience, and like, I'll come, I'll gather my data and I'll leave. And like for the, for better, I care a lot more and personally invested. So it was kind of just a process of an initial academic curiosity, and looking at, what was written and how much I either agreed or disagreed with it. And that just kind of led to where I am now. Oh, and then
on exhaustion.
So one thing that people mentioned to me that I didn't quite understand at the outset was everybody has their own agenda when you're interacting with people. Since I sort of got integrated or embedded in the history department at the University of Douala, and that became more and more apparent as I was going on. Like, people want to take your work as an opportunity to either inject some of their work or to like give you feedback. And it's kind of hard to tell the difference sometimes between someone just pushing their agenda on you versus them trying to contribute to your work. This was a bit like mentally exhausting to try to navigate this and interact with a lot of people that kind of wanted a piece of the work or to add to the work. And then, but the emotional part was harder, I think. And that really didn't subside until I started meeting people that I wanted to spend time with just socially, and just like having a way of expressing my frustrations with just the way life in Douala is, or just in general being away from home, having someone in person, you know, having a friend or two to just spend time with really changed the way I approach the field work. Because initially, you know, after a while, it's kind of like, I just want to get the data and go because I'm so tired of being here. And having a more of a social network apart from the professional network, you know, it makes being uncomfortable a more comfortable experience, I guess. Like you can lean into it a bit more. So that really changed it for me.
You know, I was kind of, one particular wording that resonates with me is that everyone has their own agenda. As in, you know, you're talking to human beings, right? Even though there are certain stories or data you want to extract from the people, you know, these are human beings and they'll tell other kind of stories that they think are important or they care more deeply about, and you can't have control over that. And yeah, just, you know, I think just realizing that as early as possible will just make your life easier as an interviewer, because you know, just knowing that and accepting that that it's going to be a part of whole process will just, you know, make you feel, I think, you know, more prepared, more better, you know, of all the time that you spend for the interview and things like that. So I'll just say that, yeah.
I think the ups and downs are part of the process, and I did my first long research in Cameroon actually, and I didn't know anything about anything, so it was much more like exciting and also really frustrating as well. I think Burundi, it was just particularly hard because it was very isolating. I was like the only white person in the province, I think, and I was in a really small city because of the fuel crisis. Even if you had a motorcycle driver, you might not have fuel, so you couldn't get somebody to take you out. And I did find, like, I found the social groups. I joined one of these like running solidarity groups, and that was helpful. And I went to Bujumbura periodically where I had more of a network and more friends, and it's just part of the process, I guess.
Yeah, I think there is this sadness and exhaustion, whatever, even if you're doing the work in the country, like it depends on the topic, but if people are unpacking heavy stuff on you. I've had interviewees who cry throughout the whole interview because they assume I'm a social worker as opposed to a sociologist, and you're asking questions and you're probing. And, you know, I have this one bad recollection of a woman saying, well, that was great, I'm going to go back to therapy. And then I had to go and interview somebody else, and I was so drained, right? Because you're like getting all those emotions. So it can be challenging. Yes, Lori, you can be. Thank you all for coming.
Lovely jobs.
I got to actually, I really like that loneliness question. Because that's why I was like, just like having glances at Dr. Professor. I'm an undergraduate, and like I'm working with her on my honors thesis, and it's around loneliness. I guess, but like this is, I thought that was really interesting responses, and I do think that there's like a really interesting kind of like the researcher's perspective of loneliness as a qualitative researcher. So I kind of wanted to ask like a follow-up, especially when, you know, if you're just like a purely participant, like you might feel, I don't know if I'm like, you know, putting something into an experience, but like you feel maybe less attached. Like, is there that experience of being, you know, you feel that you're not really part of the group, even when you're participating, or like you're just observing? Or that like there's some level of separation because of the power dynamic of being a researcher, and how does that kind of affect you, and how do you deal with that specifically?
I guess, yeah, sure. I think I think moving between different parts of like groups in Douala and outside of Douala, like throughout Cameroon, changes the experience quite a bit, right? So grabbing drinks after work with the faculty from the university felt really good. And I felt more like I was becoming more part of the sort of life in Douala, and I was becoming more comfortable on a personal level, right? But all that was stripped away if I was somewhere else conducting an interview where someone was, it was like the positionality, my foreignness, and the institutions I was not representing but affiliated with were the most apparent, and that made me feel, I was quite like alienated. I felt quite like that's when it felt, I think you used the term extractive earlier, and like at times it would feel really extractive, especially if I was in a community where they weren't going to see immediate benefits. Like I don't think anybody in like Akite cares if there's a publication in African Affairs about, like, in part from interviews that I conducted there, right? There's a bit more of the promise of collaboration with faculty and graduate students in Douala, right? So there's a little bit more that I can feel I can directly contribute. And so it varied just quite a bit from that more collaborative sense to the more extractive sense. That didn't really get at your question, though. It was more about loneliness, right? So
I mean,
Linked to mattering.
Yeah.
Mattering to matter.
Yeah.
Does the work matter to the people there, right? Or, yeah, anyone else want to take on the loneliness or?
Well, the work that I was doing did matter to the NGO, and it mattered to the national structure for different reasons. Like the national structure saw it as an opportunity to, like, spread their publicity about the movement, and the NGO also kind of for the same reasons, but they were more interested in the research product itself. So I was able, and the government has an investment in this model as well. So I was able to, do a presentation to them at the end that was useful to them, and welcome. And I don't know, I organized like a ceremony of thanks at the end for all of the people who participated. I think it was a really difficult position to be in as an employer because livelihoods are so fragile and unstable, and like just there's so much need, and like when this research ends, their job ends and their job prospects end. So there was a lot of like pleading and gratitude and like expectations and hopes for a future research project. And yeah, and especially when the prices just like skyrocketed and my salaries that I could pay them didn't. So I just felt very guilty and responsible.
We don't talk about that, like how do you process the feelings when you're there? That's, yeah, not part of the training process. So do you want to add on to that, or here?
I think what I'll say is that again, this project, I really started developing this project when I'm taking the communication class with Dr. Humphreys about the qualitative research. And then one thing that really that I learned from that class and from Dr. Humphreys was the idea of ethics of care, that you are not just going there to collect data, but you should always be aware that you're stepping into the person's private life, and then you should really care also about them as human beings, their emotions, that their kindness and things like that. And key to operationalizing that ethics of care to your interviewees is being empathetic to these people. And the thing is, if you start being empathetic to these people, you get more emotional. I feel like you get more emotionally connected, and that can also kind of backfire in terms of you also share the kind of the sadness, especially if the person cries or tells you really sad stories about the burnout, their job loss, and things like that. So there is a line to be drawn, I think, between being really caring of your interviewees and being empathetic to what they're telling you and their hardships and whatever. but also there is also a line at the end, you have to be protected, you have to defend your own emotions and your own self, right? And I don't think there is no pedagogy that can teach to drawing that line between to what degree will you be lonely and to what degree will you empathetic researcher, you know. I think it just comes with more interviews, you know. You go out there, do more interviews, be there, be in the field, and then you slowly learn like what is that threshold or the boundary that is comfortable for you. And yeah, I think it's a very subjective thing. Yeah.
Last question. And then
Yeah, sweet. Okay. Well, thank you all for sharing. I always love hearing what other grad students are doing outside of like my department. And it's great that it's the last question. I think I would love to hear like what your favorite parts of your research have been, whether that's like an experience you had, not like just like with the people, or you really like the part of your methodology that you got to do, or just like something random like that.
I think I made some really good friends. So that's one thing. The other thing is I appreciate how I evolved as a researcher while doing the field work. So I think before taking the trips, I didn't really know how they would go, right? And I didn't know how I would walk away with it, but walk away from it. But I looked forward to the person I would be afterwards. And looking back, I do appreciate how I did grow. So that's one thing. And then yeah, the people I've met.
Are you already revising the experience? Like you started at the beginning talking about how hard it was and how lonely and had no friends.
Yeah.
And like you're already about to go back out there and do it again.
So I made friends towards the end or like the middle of the second trip. So going back at the beginning of the second trip was probably like the most depressed I had been in my graduate school experience because I was thinking about how lonely I was on the first trip and thinking that's going to be like extended. And so making a couple friends during that second trip enabled me to like kind of like have a rosier view of it. Like, and I'm sure I have a bit of a rosier view going into my third one. But yeah, so the experience, like that first trip was brutal. But yeah.
Other positives? No, well, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I loved it as well. And I think part of it was, you know, adding new methods kind of as I went along and figuring out when I finally started talking with my advisor, which I should have done earlier, figuring out like what questions I've answered, what haven't I answered, and how can I get at these? Because there was a lot of things that people just won't talk about. Like they just didn't want to talk about the conflict. But then there was also like this new institution that was developed, and because I had built this trust with the community, I could have my assistants like sit in on these like really kind of confidential meetings and document these conflicts, and then just building this team and like finally figuring out where to put them all and like how to make the most of people's different skills. And it was they're really great people to work with, very hardworking, and yeah, it's a great team.
So hopefully your team is a good one, right?
So I think we're gonna wrap. I just want to remind, thank you so much to our panelists for the few people who are likely to appreciate it, really. I want to have more of these. I want to talk about a little some of the forthcoming events. We have an event on Friday, March 1st. It's Friday from 12 to 1, and Elizabeth Fox, who's the winner of the Trevor Pinch Award in 2023, is going to give a talk on rapid and applied ethnography. And then on March 25th, it's a Monday night. We're going to do that at 3:30 Monday afternoon. Jaleesa Reed and Jocelyn Poe are going to talk about their QuIRI and CCS funded research SISTA Circle methodology as method and intervention. I'm also going to be posting some qualitative talks that are being sponsored by Sociology Department and City and Regional Planning and Global Development. So if you know of talks that you think other people would benefit from hearing, let me know and we can put them on our monthly or bi-weekly newsletter. We are also going to be opening up grant applications and they're going to be due Thursday, March 7th. So there are some new requirements on this, including letting us know which QuIRI talks you've attended, as well as letting us know which qualitative methods classes you've taken. So I take it you've taken Lee Humphrey's methods class, right? So spread the word to your friends if they want to apply for funding that they should be showing up for events. And we want to create a more robust community of people that we can lean on for when we're developing our ideas. So I will be thinking more about those working groups since you said they were so great. So if you want to stay, we have some cheese and wine and beverages.